The morning they promoted him, the port smelled like diesel and salt and quiet panic. I was standing on the operations floor, coffee cooling in my hand, watching a 24-year-old in a brand new suit accept applause he hadn't earned. He smiled like a kid opening a gift he didn't understand, while my boss clapped the loudest of all. Then the boss looked straight at me and said the words that rewired everything. "You're just help. This is leadership." I nodded because that's what you do when you've learned that arguing with power only amuses it. What he didn't know was that the next day, the entire port would grind to a halt, and every executive in the building would learn the difference between help and the person quietly holding the whole thing together. I had worked Port Atlantic logistics for 16 years, long enough to remember when cargo was tracked on whiteboards and radios crackled nonstop. I wasn't flashy. I didn't wear tailored suits or drop buzzwords in meetings. I was the guy who knew which cranes overheated in humidity, which customs officers flagged shipments on Fridays, which software patches quietly broke berth assignments at midnight. I knew because I was there when problems happened, not when they were being summarized. My title was Operations Coordinator, a job that sounded small enough to ignore. In reality, it meant every moving piece eventually crossed my desk. When something didn't move, it was my phone that rang. The promotion announcement came from nowhere. A calendar invite labeled Leadership Update filled the conference room with forced smiles and crossed arms. My boss, Richard Hale, stood at the front like a man delivering a victory speech. Then he introduced Evan, his son, fresh out of business school, resume padded with internships that lasted exactly one summer each. Richard talked about fresh perspectives and modernizing port leadership. Evan talked about streamlining workflows and disrupting legacy thinking. When someone asked about his operational experience, Evan laughed and said, "That's what systems are for." Richard's eyes flicked to me. "We've got help for the details," he said. "Right." That was when he added, "You're just help." I didn't say anything. I congratulated Evan. I shook his hand. I went back to my desk and finished the shift plan for the night cruise, the one I'd been drafting before the meeting hijacked my morning. I knew what that promotion meant. Evan now had authority over schedules, overrides, and vendor approvals. He also didn't know that half our systems talked to each other because I'd built workarounds over a decade, duct tape, and institutional memory, holding together software that never quite matched reality. I was the map no one bothered to update because it still worked. That evening, Evan sent his first email. Subject line, "Immediate efficiency changes." He canceled staggered crane maintenance windows to maximize uptime. He centralized decision approval so nothing moves without leadership visibility. He replaced experienced night supervisors with one rotating manager to reduce redundancy. Each change looked good on a slide. Each one quietly removed the margins that kept the port breathing. I replied with a careful note outlining risks, delays, historical incidents. He responded with a thumbs-up emoji and a line that stuck with me. "Let's not overthink it." I went home on time that night. That alone should have worried them. I slept through my phone buzzing once, then twice. At 4:12 a.m., I woke to 37 missed calls. By the time I arrived, the port was chaos. 2 container ships sat idle because berth assignments conflicted. A crane overheated and shut down mid-lift. Customs flagged a shipment because a rushed override triggered a compliance alert. Trucks stacked up outside the gates, drivers yelling into radios. Evan stood in the middle of it all, red-faced, barking orders that contradicted each other. Richard paced, phone pressed to his ear, promising answers he didn't have. No one asked me to step in. That was the mistake. I took my seat and watched the dashboard light up red. Every alert had a name attached to it. Mine, not because I caused it, but because the systems were built assuming I'd be there to correct what leadership ignored. I opened my notebook and wrote down times. 6:03 a.m. crane 4 offline. 6:17 a.m. customs hold escalated. 6:41 a.m. demurrage penalties triggered. I documented. I didn't intervene. By noon, clients were calling. Big ones. The kind whose contracts mention penalties per hour in numbers that make rooms go quiet. Evan tried to reassure them with jargon. Richard pulled me aside and asked why I hadn't fixed it yet. I looked at him and said calmly, "I don't have the authority anymore, I'm just help." He stared at me like the words had turned into a foreign language. At 2:18 p.m., the Coast Guard issued a congestion advisory. News vans parked outside the gates. At 3:40 p.m., the board demanded an emergency call. Evan didn't speak much on that call. Richard did. He blamed weather vendors' unforeseen variables. Then a board member asked a simple question. "Who designed the operational safeguards?" Silence. Another voice followed. "And who removed them?" The next morning, I was invited into a room I hadn't been in for years. The tone was different. Apologies were implied, not spoken. They asked me to temporarily assist in restoring operations. I slid a printed document across the table. It outlined the steps, the risks, the timeline. It also outlined my conditions: authority restored, decisions respected, and Evan removed from operational command. Richard hesitated. I waited. By the end of the week, the port was moving again, slowly then smoothly. Maintenance windows returned. Night supervisors came back. Overrides were locked behind experience, not enthusiasm. Evan was reassigned to a strategic innovation role far from cranes and cargo. No announcement, no applause, just quiet corrections. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I kept doing the work I'd always done, but something had changed. When meetings happened, eyes came to me first. When decisions were proposed, they asked how it would break before asking how it would scale. And no one ever called me just help again. Because the truth is, in places that run on moving parts and real consequences, help is the job. And when you mistake it for something disposable, the whole operation collapses the moment it's gone. A month later, the port hosted a quiet town hall. No banners, no hype, just folding chairs and tired people who had lived through the fallout. Richard stood at the front and talked about lessons learned and respecting institutional knowledge. He never said my name, but he didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew who'd kept the lights on when leadership mistook confidence for competence. Afterward, a few of the night guys clapped me on the shoulder. One said, "Didn't think they'd ever get it." I told him they didn't. They just ran out of room not to. Evan stopped coming in early. Then he stopped coming in at all. His strategic role turned into a consulting contract that quietly expired. Richard aged 10 years in 10 weeks. He still wore the same suits, still talked big in meetings, but now he asked before he decided. That was the real promotion, authority shifting without a title change. I never asked for a new one. I didn't need it. My leverage wasn't on a business card. It was embedded in every process that worked because someone had bled to make it reliable. On my desk sits the same notebook, updated, dog-eared, honest. New hires still don't know my full story, and that's fine. They just know that when something goes wrong, I can tell them why before the alert finishes loading. Sometimes power looks like a corner office. Sometimes it looks like a man who knows exactly what happens when a system is disrespected and is calm enough to let others learn it the hard way. The funny thing is, the collapse didn't end the way people expect these stories to end. There was no dramatic firing in front of the whole staff, no public apology, no triumphant walkout with security watching. Real life is quieter than that. It's slower. It punishes with patience. In the weeks after operations stabilized, my calendar filled up in a way it never had before, not with status meetings or pointless alignment sessions, but with one-on-one requests. Terminal supervisors, Coast Guard liaisons, insurance auditors, even vendors who had ignored my emails for years suddenly wanted my input. They didn't ask because they liked me. They asked because they'd seen what happened when the wrong person was in charge. Richard started forwarding emails with a single line typed above the thread. "Can you take a look?" No greeting, no explanation, just quiet acknowledgement that I was no longer just help. Evan's name disappeared from distribution lists. His glass office stayed empty, the door cracked open like someone had stepped out for coffee and never come back. One afternoon, I ran into Richard by the elevators. He looked smaller somehow, like the building had grown and he hadn't. He cleared his throat and said, "We're restructuring again. I want you involved this time." I nodded, not yes, not no, just acknowledgement. I'd learned the value of silence. Silence lets people reveal how much they actually need you. I never demanded a title or a raise in that moment. I asked for something better, control over how the work was done and the authority to stop bad decisions before they reached the docks. He agreed faster than he ever had to anything I'd proposed in the last decade. Fear is a remarkable motivator. The port runs smoother now, not perfect, nothing that complex ever is, but resilient. The kind of resilience that doesn't show up on spreadsheets until it's missing. New systems were rolled out carefully. Changes were tested. Experience stopped being treated like a liability. And every so often, when a young manager talks a little too loudly about disruption and speed, someone older in the room will clear their throat and say, "Let's run that by him first." I still go home at the same hour. I still drink my coffee black. I still keep my notebook. The difference is this: no one laughs anymore when I speak. And that's how I know the lesson stuck. Months passed, and the crisis faded into a case study no one officially wrote. The Port Authority preferred not to memorialize the embarrassment, but the story traveled anyway, quietly, the way real warnings do. It moved through shipping circles and insurance breakfasts and late-night calls between operations directors who'd seen enough storms to recognize one forming. Whenever someone mentioned, "That week everything jammed up," the room went still for a second. Then someone would say, "Yeah, I heard." and the conversation would change. I noticed the shift in smaller ways. Decisions slowed down in a good way. People asked what could break before they asked what could ship. When a new hire introduced themselves as disruptive, someone else would smile and ask them to define their failure plan. Evan's experiment had taught everyone that ports don't forgive bravado, they forgive preparation. One Friday afternoon, as the sun bled orange across the cranes, Richard stopped by my desk. He didn't sit. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, staring out at the water. "I should have listened," he said finally. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't even about me. It was an admission to himself. I nodded once, that was enough. A week later, HR updated the org chart. My role didn't get flashier, but it got clearer. The fine print mattered now, authority was spelled out, escalation paths were real, and there was a line that hadn't existed before: operational veto in matters of safety, compliance, and continuity. It was the kind of power you only give someone after you've learned the cost of not giving it. I didn't frame the document, I didn't tell anyone about it. I slid it into the same drawer as the notebook, because the point was never to win. The point was to make sure the work survived the egos attached to it. On the docks, things moved again. Containers flowed. Crews joked. Radios crackled with the comfortable rhythm of people who trusted the system they were part of. Every now and then, a ship would be delayed for a reason no one outside could see, and I'd watch a young manager start to protest. Then stop, remembering the week everything went wrong. That's how institutions really change. Not with speeches, not with slogans. With one quiet lesson learned the hard way and a decision never repeated. The last ripple came when no one was looking for one. A routine audit, scheduled months in advance, buried in calendars, arrived with a polite email and a thick checklist. In the old days, audits were theater. A flurry of binders, a week of nerves, then a pass stamped through on the strength of a few familiar faces. This time it was different. The auditors asked uncomfortable questions. They traced decisions back to names. They wanted to know who had authority when things broke and who overruled whom. For once, the answers were simple. They walked the docks with me at dawn, steel-toed boots crunching on gravel, the cranes waking overhead. I showed them the redundancies we'd built since the collapse, manual overrides that didn't depend on a single dashboard, escalation ladders that didn't stop at a family name, drills that assumed a human would be tired at the worst possible moment. They nodded. They took notes. They didn't smile, which in their world meant approval. The report came back clean, not glowing, clean. The kind of clean that keeps insurance cheap and regulators distant. Richard forwarded it to the board with a short message. "This is why experience matters." No exclamation points. No credit claimed. He didn't need to say more. I heard later that Evan had landed on his feet somewhere inland in a startup with bright walls and big promises. Good for him. I hope he learned something. If not, another system will teach him. Systems always do. On my last walk of the day, I paused at the fence where you can see the whole port breathe. Lights blinking, water moving, work continuing because it's been done right 1,000 times before. That's the job, not being seen, not being praised, just making sure tomorrow looks boring. They never called me just help again, and I never corrected them when they called me something else. The truth is, I didn't stay forever. People assume stories like this end with a man finally getting the respect he deserves and settling into it. But respect is a currency that fluctuates, and I'd learned how quickly it can be devalued by the next confident voice in the room. I stayed long enough to lock the lessons into the system, long enough that it would resist the next wave of shortcuts. When the offer came, it was quiet and precise. A consultancy that specialized in port continuity and failure recovery. No flashy pitch. Just a simple sentence in an email. "We'd like you to help us prevent the kind of week you survived." I didn't negotiate hard. I didn't need to. I asked for autonomy and the ability to walk away from clients who wouldn't listen. They agreed. My last day wasn't announced. I cleared my desk after hours, slid the notebook into my bag, and left a short handover memo that focused on principles, not instructions. Anyone can follow steps. Fewer can recognize the moment to stop. That was the real inheritance. Richard shook my hand in the parking lot. He thanked me without qualifiers. I told him the port would be fine if they remembered what nearly broke it. We both knew memory fades, but sometimes scars don't. Now I spend my mornings in different cities, watching different harbors wake up. I ask the same questions everywhere. Who knows how this fails? Who has the authority to stop it? The answers tell me everything. And when someone introduces a young executive as the future, I smile and ask where the past is stored. Some lessons arrive as promotions. Others arrive as silence, backed by the sound of a system grinding to a halt. The port taught everyone the difference. Every once in a while, usually late at night after a long site visit, I think back to that meeting, the one where Richard smiled and said, "You're just help." It doesn't sting anymore. It feels instructional, like a warning label you only notice after you've ignored it once. Those words marked the moment I stopped tying my value to a title someone else could hand to their son. I see the pattern everywhere now. A veteran sidelined because they do fit the culture. A system simplified until it snaps. A room full of people who mistake youth for insight and volume for leadership. And I never interrupt. I just ask one question calmly, the way I did back then. What happens if this fails at 3 in the morning? The room usually goes quiet. Silence has weight when it's earned. Sometimes a young executive pulls me aside afterward, not Evan, someone like him, smart, ambitious, untested. They ask how to move fast without breaking things. I tell them the truth, you can't. Speed always breaks something. The trick is knowing what you're allowed to break and what will break you back. They nod. I don't know if they listen. I didn't at their age. The port still runs. I pass it sometimes from a distance when my work brings me back through the region. The cranes look the same. The water moves the same, but I know what's different. There are fewer shortcuts buried in the process, fewer assumptions written into policy, fewer people promoted because of proximity instead of proof. That's enough for me. Revenge, if you can call it that, didn't come with applause or headlines. It came as absence. The absence of chaos. The absence of laughter when someone with experience speaks. The absence of a son running a system he doesn't understand. I was never just help. I was the difference between motion and collapse. And they learned that the only way organizations ever do, by watching what happens when the wrong person is in charge and the right one quietly steps aside. What surprised me most, looking back, was how ordinary everything felt once the lesson had been learned. No grand reckoning. No villains twirling mustaches, just people adjusting their behavior after reality corrected them. That's how grown-up consequences work. They don't shout, they settle in. Years later, at a conference in Long Beach, I was speaking on operational resilience. Small room, coffee gone cold, half the audience checking their phones. Then I put up a single slide, no charts, no buzzwords, just a sentence. Systems don't fail when people make mistakes. They fail when the wrong people are allowed to make them. I didn't need to explain it. A few heads lifted. A few pens started moving. Experience recognizes its own. After the talk, a man in his 40s waited until the room cleared. He introduced himself as a deputy director at a mid-sized port on the East Coast. He hesitated, then said, "We just promoted someone's kid, smart guy." But he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I gave him my card and told him to call before the first crisis, not after. He nodded like someone who'd just been handed a life jacket and realized the water was colder than he thought. That's the thing people misunderstand about stories like this. The win isn't watching someone else lose. The win is watching the system stop bleeding because someone finally listened. The win is boring mornings, predictable afternoons, and crews going home on time. If Richard ever thinks about me now, it's probably as a cautionary tale. Not the man he insulted, but the mistake he almost couldn't undo. And that's fine. I don't need my name remembered. I just need the lesson to survive the next confident voice in a tailored suit. Because somewhere right now, a young executive is calling someone just help. And somewhere else, a system is quietly taking notes. That's the part no one warns you about, the way systems remember even when people don't. Titles change, offices get renovated, logos get refreshed, but the architecture of failure stays right where it was left. All it needs is the right kind of pressure to reveal itself again. I've watched it happen from the outside more than once. A new leader arrives with a mandate to modernize. They talk about velocity, about cutting friction, about empowering youth. They smile the same way Richard did. And somewhere in the building, someone with gray in their beard or wear in their voice quietly updates a contingency plan that no one asked to see. Experience doesn't argue anymore. It prepares. Sometimes I'm invited back after the fact, after the first warning shot has already been fired. A missed shipment, a near miss, a regulatory letter that uses the word concerned 3 times in one paragraph. I never say, "I told you so." I don't need to. The room already knows. You can tell by the way they listen now, the way they don't interrupt, the way they ask questions that start with what if instead of why not. On those days, I think about the younger version of myself, sitting in that conference room, hearing laughter where there should have been curiosity. I wish I could tell him something useful, not to fight harder, not to demand respect. Just this, let the system speak for you. It always does eventually, and when it does, it's louder than any title. I still keep the notebook. New cover now, different cities scribbled across the pages, but the first rule written inside hasn't changed. Never confuse familiarity with understanding. It's a reminder for me as much as anyone else. No one is immune to shortcuts. No one is permanently right. Some evenings, when I'm done and the harbor lights flicker on, I sit and watch the work continue without me. That's how I know I did it right. The system doesn't need me anymore, but it remembers what happened when it was ignored. And somewhere out there, another boss is laughing at the wrong person. The clock has already started ticking.